Let's start with a very basic overview of the region. Let's address these 3 questions. What is Latin America? Why does it have that name? Why should we learn about it? This map shows the region that is often called Latin America. It includes Mexico, Central America, and all of South America. But what about the Caribbean? Definitions become much more complicated when we start talking about the Caribbean islands. The term Latin America was applied by a French geographer in the 19th century to refer to the part of the Americas that was colonized by speakers of the Romance family of languages, which are derived from Latin. The Romance languages brought to the Americas by colonial powers include Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Applied strictly, therefore, Latin America would include Haiti, which was a French colony. Many people use the term Latin America more specifically to apply to the regions once colonized substantially or exclusively by Spain or Portugal. It is often thought that because of that shared colonial experience, those countries would be culturally similar in the present. There is some truth to that, as we shall see. However, the region's history is not so simple. Some areas were not fully conquered and colonized by the Spanish and Portuguese, but the indigenous people had a lot of cultural autonomy and freedom, and therefore speaking of them as Latin Americans would erase some interesting differences. Secondly, in other areas, especially in parts of the Caribbean, the Spanish and Portuguese never had much of a foothold, if any, but the regions were subsequently colonized by other European powers, including the British, Dutch, and French. Consequently, there is a great deal of cultural diversity in the region. What we aim to do in this course is to keep that diversity as our focus. There is not one Latin American culture, but a multiplicity of ways of being in the world. We have only so much time in this course, so we cannot cover the entire region comprehensively. We will focus more on the regions substantially colonized for centuries by Spain and Portugal, but we will touch on some other countries that had subsequent colonizers as well, specifically Belize, Haiti, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago, because we can learn a lot through those comparisons. How many people live in Latin America? In 2020, an estimated 652 million people lived in Latin America and the Caribbean. This constitutes 9% of the world's population. People usually include within Latin America the following countries and possessions. I would like for you to be able to identify all of these on a map. There are 23 independent nations. In what is often called Middle America, going from north to south, we have Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. In South America, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Paraguay, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela. In the Caribbean, we have Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Then there are 2 polities that are not independent nation states but are claimed as the possession of others, including Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, and French Guiana. In the Caribbean, there are many other independent nation states and claimed territories that are not usually included under the name Latin America, even though many were claimed and or colonized first by Spain, but were later seized by other colonial powers. You do not need to know all of these for this course, but we will touch on Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, both of which were former British colonies. If we are going to take a purely ethnocentric perspective and ask why is Latin America important for U.S. residents to know about, we could talk first about its political importance. Our most important trading partners are in Latin America. Mexico and Brazil both are in the top 10. In 2019, for example, the trade in goods and services between the U.S. and Mexico was an estimated $677.3 billion. This photo is of cargo trucks lined up at the U.S.-Mexico border to import goods, many of which may be produced through U.S.-Mexican corporate partnerships. U.S. companies outsource a good deal of manufacturing to other Latin American countries as well. There have long been plans for a free trade area of the Americas, which would have been more powerful economically than the European Union. Also, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which is a free trade region including most of the countries of the Americas and Pacific Rim countries, was about to be entered into by the U.S., although President Trump nixed those plans when he entered office. They may be revived under the Biden administration. Latin America is also the greatest source of immigrants to the United States. In the 2010 census, 16% of the total population identified as Hispanic or Latino. We must stress, however, that there is a sizable Hispanic population that lived in the region before they became incorporated into the United States. The entire American Southwest was once part of Mexico, and those people, therefore, are not immigrants or descendants of immigrants. The region is of critical importance to the world also in terms of natural resources. If we consider oil, Venezuela has the biggest proven oil reserves in the world. Mexico is the second greatest source of oil imports to the U.S. Brazil is the world's 10th largest crude oil producer. Brazil is also the second greatest producer of iron in the world. As for tin, Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia are all in the top 10. Peru is the 5th largest source of gold for the world market. The region's massive rainforests in Middle and South America are valued as sources of lumber, hydroelectric energy, and biodiversity. If we consider the region in terms of culture, apart from any strategic value, the region has enormous significance. In the region today, even 5 centuries after the Spanish invasion, there are about 570 indigenous languages spoken. While the European conquest had devastating effects on the indigenous populations, the fact that 570 languages persist until the present is one indication of cultural survival and resilience. This map, for example, shows the various indigenous languages spoken just in the small country of Guatemala. There are 5 different languages that were imported by colonial powers: Spanish, Portuguese, English, Dutch, and French. There are also Creole languages. Creole languages are new languages that emerge in cross-cultural conditions, such as slavery, trade, and colonization, situations in which people who speak radically different languages have to create a way of communicating. Creole languages often consist of grammatical structures from one language sprinkled with vocabulary from another. They start off as a simple shorthand form of communication called a pidgin. Over time, however, they can become fully developed languages of their own, at which point they are called Creole languages, with strict grammatical rules and ample vocabularies. In the United States, for example, a French Creole emerged in Louisiana. In Latin America, there are English Creole languages spoken in Jamaica and Belize. In terms of world history, the cultural clash of Latin America is unparalleled. The region's population represents the mixing of the indigenous people, those whom Columbus called Indians, the European colonizers, and the descendants of about 10 million enslaved Africans brought to the region. The European colonization of the Americas led to catastrophic loss of life. Through the wars of conquest, the disruption of food production due to colonial economic demands, and forced resettlement and labor. The biggest killers, though, were invisible. The Spaniards brought with them to the Americas a number of diseases to which the indigenous people had no immunities, leading in some regions to a 90% decline in the population within the first century. The colonizers also set out to forcibly change the cultures of the indigenous and enslaved peoples. As well, population mixing over time and the interaction of neighboring people led to creative cultural combinations. The cultural beliefs and practices that have come out of these and other powerful political transformations over the centuries are exactly the sort of thing that we'll be looking at this semester. That's all for now.